The midday heat pressed down on Redemption Creek like a heavy blanket, making the air shimmer above the dusty street. Even the buzzards circling overhead seemed to hang motionless in the still air, reluctant to waste energy in the sweltering Arizona sun. The small crowd that had gathered before the courthouse shifted uncomfortably, sweat darkening their collars, as they watched the scene unfolding before them. A makeshift gallows stood in stark relief against the cloudless sky. The rough-hewn wood hastily assembled that morning creaked ominously in the heat. Upon the platform stood Thomas Ravenwing, his 15-year-old frame seeming impossibly small against the desert backdrop. His hands were bound before him with coarse rope that had already rubbed his wrists raw, but his dark eyes remained steady, refusing to show fear, even as the hangman adjusted the noose with methodical precision. Below Elena, Ravenwing knelt in the dust, her knees pressed into earth that seemed to burn through her worn skirt. Her long black braid streaked with a few strands of silver hung over one shoulder. 5 years of hardship since her husband's death had etched lines around her eyes, but they had done nothing to diminish the fierce dignity in her bearing. Her weathered hands, strong from years of working the land alone, were clasped not in supplication, but in what appeared to be prayer, though whether to the Christian God or to older spirits none could tell. "My son is innocent," she said, her voice carrying a calm authority that belied her kneeling position. "The gold watch was Joseph's gift from the army. How can you condemn a boy for claiming what is rightfully his inheritance?" Sheriff Warren shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his hand unconsciously touching the tarnished star on his chest. His eyes darted toward the imposing figure of Fletcher Reed, who stood on the boardwalk before the town's only hotel. Reed's expensive suit and polished boots marked him as a man apart from the dusty townsfolk. His silver-studded belt caught the sunlight as he hooked his thumbs into it, a gesture of casual dominance that needed no words. "The law is clear," Fletcher called out, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Theft is theft, and when these people—" he gestured dismissively toward Elena, not bothering to hide his contempt, "steal from white men, they need to learn there are consequences." A murmur passed through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, though their eyes remained downcast, unwilling to meet Elena's steady gaze. Others looked away entirely, shame evident in the slump of their shoulders. Fletcher Reed wasn't just the richest man in Redemption Creek. He owned the water rights to Silver Creek, controlled the cattle yards, and held the mortgages on half the businesses in town. For most of these people, opposing Fletcher Reed wasn't just difficult, it was impossible. The hangman finished adjusting the noose and stepped back, nodding to Sheriff Warren that all was ready. Elena's composure finally cracked, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. "Please," she said, her voice breaking as she looked up at the sheriff. "He's just a boy. My only child." Sheriff Warren looked away, unable to meet her eyes. In the 5 years since Joseph Ravenwing's death, he had watched Elena struggle to raise her son alone, facing prejudice and hardship with quiet dignity. He'd seen Thomas grow from a solemn child into a young man who carried himself with his father's pride. Deep down, Warren doubted the boy was guilty, but crossing Fletcher Reed wasn't an option, not if he wanted to keep his position, not if he wanted to stay alive. "Justice must be served," he said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. Fletcher's laugh was cold and sharp as breaking glass. "Old enough to steal, old enough to hang." The crowd's discomfort grew palpable in the shimmering heat. A few women turned away, unable to watch. Rose Walker, the town's boarding house owner, pressed a handkerchief to her lips, her lined face creased with horror. Even Father Timothy, standing at the edge of the gathering with his Bible clutched to his chest, seemed at a loss for words or comfort. "This ain't right," someone muttered from the back of the crowd. "Not for a watch." As the hangman moved to place the noose around Thomas's neck, the boy finally spoke, his young voice steady despite everything. "I didn't steal it," he said clearly. "That watch belonged to my father. Mr. Reed knows it." His eyes, so like Joseph's, fixed on Fletcher, with an accusation that made the older man's jaw tighten. For just a moment, uncertainty flickered in Reed's gaze there, and gone so quickly that most missed it entirely. "Lying won't save you, boy," Fletcher called out, his voice harder now. "Get on with it, Warren." The sheriff raised his hand reluctantly, preparing to give the signal that would drop the trap door beneath Thomas's feet. Elena closed her eyes, her lips moving in a prayer older than the Christian faith that had come to these lands. In the Apache tongue of her ancestors, she called to the earth beneath her knees, feeling its ancient power thrumming through her palms pressed against the dirt. "Grandfather Earth, you who remember all things, all blood spilled upon your back, all tears that water your skin, hear me now. Do not let my son's blood join that which already stains this ground." A figure pushed through the gathered townsfolk, moving with the slight imbalance of a man missing a limb. His left sleeve was pinned neatly to the side of his worn but clean jacket, and despite his disability, he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a soldier. The crowd parted before him, more out of surprise than respect. Samuel Hawkins stopped at the foot of the gallows, looking up at Sheriff Warren, with clear gray eyes that had seen the worst of the war between the states. "Sheriff," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of command that had once led men into battle, "you planning to hang a boy with no trial on the word of one man?" Sheriff Warren's hand unconsciously moved to his gun belt, a nervous habit he'd developed over years of enforcing Fletcher Reed's will rather than the actual law. The boy was caught with Reed's property, Hawkins, open and shut case. "Is it?" Samuel challenged, turning to address the crowd. "Has anyone here seen this gold watch? Has anyone confirmed it belongs to Mr. Reed, and not to Joseph Ravenwing, who served this country as a scout in the Apache campaigns?" His words stirred something in the townsfolk. Joseph Ravenwing had been respected in Redemption Creek, one of the few Apache who had bridged the gap between the white settlers and his own people. Many remembered his quiet dignity, his willingness to help during drought or disease, his patient mediation during disputes with nearby tribes. Fletcher stepped down from the boardwalk, spurs jingling with each deliberate step. His shadow fell long across the dusty ground as he approached Samuel, his hand casually resting on the pearl-handled revolver at his hip. "You questioning my words, soldier?" The title was spoken with contempt, a sneer twisting his handsome features. Samuel didn't flinch. "I'm questioning whether this town still believes in justice, or if we've forgotten what so many died for back east." A tense silence fell. Even the desert birds seemed to hold their calls. Fletcher moved closer to Samuel, using his height advantage to look down on the one-armed veteran. "This isn't your concern. You weren't even here during the troubles with the Apache. Too busy losing your arm back east, I hear." Samuel's jaw tightened, the only sign that the barb had landed. "I was at Gettysburg, Mr. Reed. Where did you serve again? I don't recall seeing your name in the regiment logs." A dangerous stillness came over Fletcher's face. Before he could respond, Elena rose from her knees with a fluid grace that drew all eyes to her. With quiet dignity, she stepped between the two men, her eyes never leaving Fletcher's face. "If my son's blood stains this ground today," she said, her voice carrying a weight beyond her small frame, "the earth will demand justice. In 7 days, it will claim what is owed." Fletcher's laugh was sharp as a knife's edge. "More Indian superstition. Next, You'll be doing a rain dance." "Not superstition," Elena replied evenly. "Promise?" The air seemed to still further the heat, pressing down like a physical weight. Elena's words hung in the silence, and for just a moment uncertainty flickered across Fletcher's face. Something in her eyes, knowledge perhaps, or a certainty that transcended fear, made him look away first. Sheriff Warren cleared his throat, eager to break the tension. "Let's get on with it." The hangman positioned Thomas over the trap door. The boy stood straight, his young face set in lines too old for his years. He looked at his mother and gave a small, brave nod that nearly broke her heart. "Be strong, mother," he called softly. "I will see father soon." Elena closed her eyes, her lips moving in silent prayer, the words of her ancestors flowing through her like water over stone. She pressed her palms harder against the earth, feeling a connection as old as her bloodline, as ancient as the mountains that ringed the valley. "Grandfather Earth, you who hold the bones of my ancestors, you who drank the blood of my beloved Joseph, hear me now. Show these people your power. Show them that the land remembers when justice is denied." The sound came first, a distant rumble that seemed to rise from the earth itself. At first many mistook it for thunder, though the sky remained cloudless and harsh. Then dust bloomed on the horizon like a storm rising without warning. People turned, shielding their eyes against the sun, to see the source of the disturbance. A stampede of wild horses, at least 20 strong, thundered down the main street of Redemption Creek, seemingly appearing from nowhere in the clear day. Their hooves struck the earth with a rhythm like war drums, sending townsfolk scattering for safety. At their head ran a magnificent Palomino stallion, its coat gleaming like gold in the sunlight. Elena recognized the stallion instantly. It was Sundance, the wild horse that Joseph had often spoken of, but never managed to tame. The Apache believed that such free spirits were messengers between worlds, embodiments of natural power that could never truly be conquered. The horses charged straight through town, directly toward the gallows. Sheriff Warren dove from the platform in panic. The hangman followed, abandoning his post. The crowd scattered in terror as the wild herd tore through their powerful bodies, knocking against the gallows supports. The wooden structure shuddered, timbers cracking under the assault. Thomas struggled to keep his balance as the platform beneath him began to give way. With a splintering crash, one side of the gallows collapsed, sending the boy tumbling to the ground, the noose pulling free as he fell. Elena rushed forward through the chaos, throwing herself over her son's body as horses continued to surge past on either side as though parting around them deliberately. Their eyes met in a moment of breathless disbelief before Samuel Hawkins appeared at their side, using his single arm to help drag Thomas clear of the fallen timber. "Are you hurt?" Elena asked urgently, her hands moving over her son's body, checking for injuries. Thomas shook his head, his eyes wide with wonder. "Did you call them mother?" "The horses," Elena touched his face gently. "The earth provides when justice demands it." As suddenly as they had appeared, the wild horses were gone, vanishing down the far end of the street in a cloud of dust that settled slowly in the stunned silence that followed. Fletcher Reed's face had gone pale beneath his tan. He stared at Elena with something close to fear before rage overtook his features. "This changes nothing," he shouted, striding toward Elena, who now stood protectively in front of her son. "The boy's still guilty. The gallows are destroyed," Samuel pointed out calmly. "Seems like a sign to me." Fletcher's face contorted with fury. "Sign? It was a coincidence." Or, his eyes narrowed at Elena, "some Apache trick." The townspeople murmured amongst themselves, many crossing themselves or touching lucky charms. What they'd witnessed felt too strange to be mere chance. Rose Walker, the boarding house owner, whispered to the woman beside her, "Just like when the creek changed course, the day old man Mathers challenged Reed's water rights." Fletcher turned to the sheriff, who was dusting himself off, looking shaken. "Lock the boy up. We'll rebuild the gallows tomorrow." Sheriff Warren hesitated, glancing at the townsfolk. The mood had shifted. No one seemed eager to see the hanging proceed after what they'd just witnessed. "Maybe we should reconsider," he suggested carefully.
"Perhaps a lesser punishment." Fletcher's hand shot out, grabbing the sheriff's shirt.
"Are you defying me, Warren?" he hissed, quiet enough that only those nearest could hear. "Remember who paid for your sister's doctor when the consumption came. Remember who can take your badge and your life whenever I choose." The sheriff's resolve visibly crumbled. He nodded, then gestured to his deputy to take hold of Thomas. Elena stepped forward, placing herself between the lawman and her son. "If you touch him again—" Fletcher backhanded her across the face with sudden violence. The crack of palm against cheek echoed in the suddenly silent street. Elena felt hard blood blooming at the corner of her mouth, her braid coming loose and spilling black hair across the dust. The crowd gasped. Even those who had no love for the Apache were shocked by the brutality of the blow against a woman. Samuel moved to intervene, but Fletcher's ranch hands closed ranks around their boss hands, hovering near their holsters. "That's what happens to Indians who threaten white men," Fletcher announced loudly. "Take the boy." The deputy hesitated, his young face troubled, but a nod from the sheriff compelled him forward. He took Thomas by the arm, gentler than necessary, and began leading him toward the jailhouse. Thomas looked back at his mother, fear for her overwhelming his own plight. "Mother." "I'll be all right," Elena called to him, pushing herself up from the dirt. "Stay strong, my son. Remember who you are, a raven-winged son of Joseph. Hold to your father's courage." As Thomas was led away, Elena rose to her feet, wiping blood from her lip with the back of her hand. She stood tall, her loosened hair falling around her shoulders like a warrior's cloak. Her eyes fixed on Fletcher Reed, with a stare so intense that some of the onlookers stepped back involuntarily. "You took your fun today," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the now silent street. "In 7 days, I will take everything." Fletcher scoffed, but those close enough noticed his hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his vest. "Get this squaw out of my sight." He ordered no one in particular, then turned and stalked toward the saloon, his men following in his wake. The crowd dispersed slowly, voices hushed in discussion of what they'd witnessed. Some cast sympathetic glances toward Elena, though none dared offer help, while Fletcher's men still lingered nearby. Only Samuel Hawkins approached her, offering his handkerchief for her bloodied lip. "That was quite a declaration," he said quietly. Elena accepted the cloth, pressing it gently to her mouth. "It wasn't a declaration," she replied. "It was a promise." She reached into the pouch at her waist and withdrew a long strip of leather decorated with small beads and feathers, an Apache counting cord. Methodically, she tied 7 knots in it, one after another, each knot tight and deliberate. "What are those for?" Samuel asked. "To count the days," Elena said simply. "The earth remembers Mr. Hawkins, and so will I." The memories came strongest at sunset. Elena sat on the porch of her small cabin as the day's heat began to relent, watching the western sky turn to fire. This had been Joseph's favorite time, the boundary between day and night, when he said the veil between worlds grew thin. He would sit in this very spot, smoking his pipe, telling Thomas stories of the Apache ways, while Elena mended clothes or prepared herbs for medicine. 5 years gone, and still she expected to hear his footsteps, to feel his hand on her shoulder, to hear his voice calling her Shizee, my heart. The cabin stood at the edge of town, the last outpost before the vast wilderness beyond. Joseph had built it with his own hands when they'd first married, combining white man's construction with Apache wisdom. The roof was oriented to catch the winter sun, but block the summer heat. The walls were thick adobe that kept the interior cool even in the fiercest heat. Behind the cabin, a small garden flourished with traditional plants, medicines, and foods that connected Elena to her heritage. It was all she had left of him now. Inside, she lit a single candle and knelt before a small wooden chest in the corner. She opened it carefully, revealing Joseph's treasures: his faded uniform jacket from his days as an army scout, a pair of beaded moccasins she had made for their wedding, his ceremonial pipe, and a small pouch of sacred tobacco. She touched each item gently, feeling his presence in the worn leather, the rough wool. At the bottom of the chest lay a faded photograph, creased and yellowed with age. Joseph stood proud in his scout's uniform beside a group of soldiers. Among them, barely recognizable with 2 good arms and fewer lines on his face, was Samuel Hawkins, and at the edge of the frame, partially cut off, but unmistakable with his distinctive belt buckle, stood Fletcher Reed. Elena held the photograph closer to the candle, studying Fletcher's younger face. He wore an officer's uniform, though Joseph had once confided that Fletcher had never earned such a rank. There were rumors that he had purchased the uniform along with medals he hadn't won to create a heroic past for himself after avoiding most of the actual fighting. "Guide me," she whispered to her husband's memory. "Show me how to save our son and bring justice for your blood." The candle flame flickered, as though in response, casting elongated shadows across the cabin's rough walls. In that dancing light, Elena could almost see Joseph's face, his kind eyes, his gentle smile that had always been reserved for her and Thomas. The grief rose in her chest, like a tide threatening to drown her, as it had in those first terrible months after his death. But now it was tempered with purpose. 7 days. 7 opportunities to right the wrongs that had been done. 7 chances to ensure that Joseph's murder did not go unpunished. Because despite what Fletcher Reed had told the town, despite the official record stating that Joseph Ravenwing had died in an accident falling from a cliff while tracking stray cattle, Elena knew the truth. She had seen the marks on his body when they'd brought him home, bruises that spoke of a fight, not a fall. A wound at the back of his head made by a weapon, not rocks. She had kept her suspicions quiet these 5 years, watching and waiting, gathering what small evidence she could while raising Thomas alone. As an Apache widow in a white man's town, direct accusations would have been worse than useless. They would have been dangerous, perhaps fatal, for both her and her son. But now Fletcher had forced her hand by targeting Thomas. The time for silence had passed. Elena closed the chest and moved to the small altar in the corner of the room. There, among eagle feathers and sacred stones, sat a clay bowl filled with earth soil taken from Joseph's grave. She sprinkled water on it from a small pottery vessel, then touched her fingers to the moist earth. "I begin the count today, beloved," she whispered in Apache. "Day 1, I touch his horse." Samuel Hawkins couldn't sleep that night. The events at the gallows played through his mind again and again. The boy's stoic face, the thundering horses, Elena Ravenwing's blood-streaked promise. He sat on the edge of his bed in the small room above the gunsmith's shop, rolling a cigarette one-handed with the practiced ease of years of adaptation. The war had taken his arm at Antietam, along with his faith in mankind's basic decency. He'd seen too much brutality, too much senseless death. When peace finally came, he'd wandered west, hoping to find a place where the echoes of cannon fire didn't follow him into his dreams. Redemption Creek had seemed promising at first, a small settlement far from the battlefields where he'd left his youth and his innocence. But it hadn't taken long to recognize that the town lived under a different kind of tyranny. Fletcher Reed ruled through fear and money, squeezing the life from the community while wrapping himself in the respectability of his wealth. Samuel lit his cigarette, watching the match flame dance in the darkness. The glow illuminated the worn photograph he'd placed on the small table beside him, the same unit portrait that Elena had in her chest, though his copy was even more faded from years of handling. His eyes found Joseph Ravenwing's face among the gathered men. They'd served together briefly during the Apache campaigns before Samuel had been reassigned east to join the bloodbath of the Civil War. Joseph had been different from the other scouts, educated, thoughtful, caught between two worlds, but determined to build bridges between them. Samuel had never forgotten how Joseph had saved his life during an ambush, dragging him to safety while bullets kicked up dust around them. When Samuel had asked why an Apache would risk his life for a white soldier, Joseph had simply said, "The earth doesn't see the color of the blood that falls upon it. Neither should we." And now Joseph's son was in jail for claiming what had likely been his father's all along. Samuel took a long drag on his cigarette, the smoke curling in the still air. There had been something in Fletcher's reaction today when the horses came. Recognition followed by fear, as though he'd witnessed something he understood all too well, something that connected to Joseph's death 5 years ago. There was history there, Samuel was certain, and if anyone knew the truth of it, it would be Elena Ravenwing. The first light of dawn found Elena already awake, preparing a small bundle of food for Thomas. She had slept little, her dreams filled with images of horses and dust and blood on stone. As she worked, she hummed a traditional Apache song, one her grandmother had taught her a melody to give strength to those facing adversity. The town was still quiet as she made her way to the jailhouse, the early morning air cool against her skin. She touched the first knot on her counting cord, feeling the smooth leather beneath her fingertips. Day 1 had begun. Sheriff Warren was alone when she arrived, looking as though he hadn't slept well either. Shadows darkened the skin beneath his eyes, and his hand shook slightly as he unlocked the door to let her in. 10 minutes, he said gruffly. That's all. Elena nodded, not trusting herself to speak civilly to this man who had been willing to hang her son. Thomas sat on the narrow cot in his cell, his young face lighting up when he saw her. She was struck, as always, by how much he resembled Joseph, the same proud bearing, the same thoughtful eyes that seemed to see more than others. "Are you hurt?" she asked softly, passing the bundle of food through the bars. Thomas shook his head. "The deputy's been kind enough." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Did you really cause those horses to come, Mother?" Elena smiled sadly. "The earth provides when justice demands it, but we must be worthy of its help." She watched as he unwrapped the cornbread she'd baked before dawn. "Your father would be proud of your courage." Thomas's face darkened. "Father would want me to fight. Fletcher Reed is a liar and a thief. That watch was Father's, given to him by the army for saving those soldiers during the ambush. Everyone knows it." "Fighting isn't always done with fists or guns," Elena said softly. "Your father taught me that. Sometimes the strongest weapon is truth." She glanced at the sheriff, who pretended not to be listening, but whose posture had stiffened at the mention of Joseph's name. "I need you to be strong for 7 days," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can you do that for me?" Thomas nodded solemnly. "What will happen in 7 days?" Elena's eyes took on a distant look. "Justice." Thomas studied her face, seeming to understand more than his years would suggest. "You know, don't you? You know what really happened to Father." Elena placed her hand over his, where it gripped the cell bars. "I have always known Shiazi, and soon everyone else will, too." As she left the jailhouse, she spotted Fletcher Reed, watching her from the porch of the town's only hotel. Their eyes met across the dusty street, a current of unspoken history passing between them. Elena didn't look away, first, her gaze steady and unflinching. Eventually, it was Fletcher who broke the connection, turning abruptly to speak to one of his ranch hands. She touched the first knot on her leather counting cord. Day one had begun, and with it, Fletcher Reed's reckoning. Martha Reed had once been known as the prettiest girl in 3 counties. The daughter of a successful merchant in Santa Fe, she had been educated back east and had returned to the Southwest with dreams of bringing culture and refinement to the frontier. Her skill as a nurse during the war had earned her respect beyond her beauty, and she had tended to wounded soldiers with competence and compassion that many still remembered. How she had ended up as Fletcher Reed's wife was a question that had puzzled many over the years. Some said it was his charm and good looks before bitterness had etched itself into his features. Others whispered about her family's financial troubles after the war, suggesting a marriage of convenience that benefited her father's struggling business. Whatever the truth, 15 years of marriage to Fletcher Reed had transformed the vibrant, compassionate Martha into a shadow. She rarely appeared in town these days, her once active involvement in church and community affairs reduced to occasional glimpses through the windows of their carriage or at church on Sundays, where she sat silent and still beside her husband. This morning, Martha stood at her bedroom window, watching Fletcher pace the courtyard of their sprawling ranch house. His agitation was evident in every line of his body, his voice carrying up to her as he berated a stable hand. "What do you mean, can't find him? That stallion cost more than your miserable life is worth." Martha's hand went unconsciously to her throat, where a high collar hid the fading bruises from Fletcher's last outburst. The truth hidden beneath long sleeves and careful dressing was that Martha Reed lived in constant fear of her husband's temper. His charming public persona masked a private cruelty that had broken her spirit year by year, isolation by isolation, until she felt as insubstantial as a ghost in her own home. But today, something was different. Fletcher's reaction to the missing horse seemed excessive even for him. She had never seen him so unsettled by anything, except perhaps the night 5 years ago when he'd returned home with blood on his boots and Joseph Ravenwing's gold watch in his pocket. Martha remembered Joseph well from her days as a nurse. He had been kind to her, speaking gently in his perfect English about his hopes for his young son, his plans to expand his small ranch, his dream of a future where Apache and white could live as neighbors without fear or hatred. Once he'd mentioned knowing Fletcher, though her husband had later denied any significant acquaintance with the Indian scout. After Joseph's death, Martha had noticed changes in her husband, increased drinking nightmares that left him shouting in his sleep, a new vigilance about the boundaries of their property. When she dared to ask if he knew anything about Joseph's accident, Fletcher's backhand had split her lip and left her unconscious for hours. She'd never asked again. But she had wondered in the quiet moments when Fletcher was away from the ranch what secrets her husband carried. Now, watching his uncharacteristic fear, Martha felt a long-dormant spark of curiosity and perhaps hope flicker to life. Perhaps Elena Ravenwing's promise of 7 days had awakened something in Fletcher that he'd thought safely buried. Perhaps, after all these years, there might finally be justice for Joseph. And though she hardly dared think it freedom for herself, the black stallion remembered. Elena watched the magnificent animal drink from the small spring in the hidden canyon where she had led him. His coat gleamed in the dappled sunlight, filtering through the cottonwood trees, his powerful muscles rippling beneath the skin. This horse had been Joseph's pride, a gift from the army for his service. After Joseph's death, it had mysteriously appeared in Fletcher's stables, along with the gold watch and several other possessions that had once belonged to her husband. Fletcher had claimed to have purchased the stallion from a trader passing through, but Elena knew better. The horse still responded to the Apache commands Joseph had taught him, still turned his head at the sound of Joseph's special whistle. "He stole you too, didn't he?" she murmured, stroking the stallion's neck. "Took you from the land where you belonged and made you serve him instead." The horse nickered softly, pushing his muzzle against her palm. Elena smiled, remembering how Joseph had looked astride this same stallion, tall and proud in his scout's uniform. Her husband had been a bridge between worlds. Apache by birth, educated at a government school, respected by both his people and the army he served. He had believed in the possibility of peace and understanding between their peoples, until Fletcher Reed had destroyed that belief along with Joseph's life. Elena leaned her forehead against the horse's muzzle, drawing strength from the connection to her husband's memory. "We begin the count today," she told the stallion, touching the first knot on her leather strip. "Day 1, I touch his horse." She allowed herself one moment of grief, one tear that traced a path down her cheek and fell to the earth below. Then she straightened, wiping the moisture away with a resolute hand. "Now," she said to the horse, "we wait for him to notice what else I've taken." By mid-afternoon, word had spread throughout Redemption Creek that Fletcher Reed's prized black stallion was missing. His men scoured the town and surrounding countryside, questioning everyone they encountered with increasing hostility. Several ranch hands were seen leading their horses through the chaparral beyond town, following tracks that seemed to lead in circles before disappearing entirely. Elena watched from the shade of the general store porch as 2 of Fletcher's men interrogated Rose Walker outside her boarding house. The elderly woman stood her ground admirably, informing them that she had better things to do than keep track of Fletcher Reed's horse. "Perhaps," she suggested with deceptive sweetness, "he ran off because he finally got tired of his master's company. I know I would." The men stalked off, leaving Rose looking after them with a satisfied expression. She caught Elena's eye across the street and gave a barely perceptible nod before returning to her sweeping. Small acts of defiance, Elena thought. Seeds that might grow into something larger. As she turned to leave, she nearly collided with Samuel Hawkins, who had approached silently, despite his disability. "Mrs. Ravenwing," he greeted her, tipping his hat. "I was hoping we might talk." Elena studied him for a moment, weighing her words carefully. "Walk with me to the creek," she said finally. "It's cooler there." They made their way through town in silence, aware of the curious glances that followed them. An Apache woman and a one-armed veteran made an unusual pair in Redemption Creek. When they reached the small stream that gave the town half its name, Elena led Samuel to a shaded spot beneath a cottonwood tree. She sat on a flat rock, arranging her skirts around her, while Samuel settled awkwardly on another stone nearby. "You knew my husband," she said without preamble. Samuel nodded. "Served with him briefly before I was sent east for the big war. Joseph was a good man, one of the best scouts I ever knew." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "His death never sat right with me." "Because it wasn't an accident," Elena said flatly, her fingers unconsciously finding the first knot on her counting cord, despite what Fletcher Reed claimed. Samuel leaned forward, his gray eyes intent. "I've suspected as much. Reed has too many convenient accidents around him." Elena's gaze drifted to the flowing water, watching it catch the sunlight and break it into 1,000 glittering fragments. 3 days before he died, Joseph came home troubled. He had been helping survey the northern boundaries of Reed's land for the territorial records. He found something there, old markers that didn't match Reed's claim documents with altered dates. Land fraud, Samuel suggested. Elena nodded slowly. And more. My husband believed Fletcher had falsified not only his land claims, but his entire history. His military service, his family background, perhaps even his name. She met Samuel's surprised gaze. Joseph was going to the territorial office with evidence. The day after he told me of his plans, he was found dead at the bottom of Copper Canyon. What kind of evidence? Elena shook her head. He never showed me specifics. He said it was safer if I didn't know the details. Her eyes held Samuel's dark and intense. But I know it involved the war and what Reed did or didn't do during it. Samuel's face hardened. Reed claims to have fought at Gettysburg and Antietam. Says he was with the 5th Connecticut. I checked the regimental records when I first came to town, curious about another veteran. His name isn't there. Then where was he during those years? That, Samuel said grimly, is what I intend to find out. Elena studied him for a long moment. Why do you care, Mr. Hawkins? This isn't your fight. Samuel looked down at his empty sleeve, then out at the vast Arizona landscape, stretching beyond the creek. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the gentle sound of flowing water and the occasional call of a desert bird. When you've seen as much injustice as I have, Mrs. Ravenwing, he finally said, you start to recognize that most fights should be everybody's concern. He met her gaze steadily. Besides, I owe Joseph. He saved my life once. Never got to repay him. Elena nodded slowly, a new understanding forming between them. Then, perhaps, now is your chance. She stood gathering her skirts. But be careful. Fletcher Reed has destroyed many who stood against him. I've faced worse than him, Samuel replied, rising to his feet, though I am curious about those horses yesterday. Quite the coincidence. A mysterious smile curved Elena's lips. My people believe the earth remembers every injustice done upon it. Sometimes it chooses to act. Samuel looked skeptical but didn't argue. Your son, they're keeping him at least until tomorrow. I'll try to visit him if they'll let me. Thank you, Elena said. She hesitated, then added, there's something else you should know. The gold watch Fletcher claims Thomas stole, it has an inscription inside the cover, to Joseph Ravenwing for valor and loyalty from the men of Company B. If you see it, look for those words. Samuel nodded thoughtfully. That would certainly complicate Reed's claim of ownership. That's why he wants it back so badly. It proves the lie. Elena turned to leave, then paused. 7 days, Mr. Hawkins. The count has begun. As she walked away, Samuel called after her. What happens after 7 days? Elena looked back over her shoulder, her face solemn in the dappled light. Justice. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Elena returned to her cabin to prepare for the night ahead. Day 1 was nearly complete, but her work had just begun. From a small chest beneath her bed, she withdrew a bundle wrapped in deerskin. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a collection of small clay pots filled with various powders and dried herbs. These were her grandmother's medicines, knowledge, passed down through generations of Apache healers. Some brought sleep, others wakefulness. Some induced visions, others clarity of mind. Elena had never used them for harm, only for healing and ceremonial purposes, but tonight she would use them differently. She selected a pot containing a fine gray powder, a mixture of herbs that when burned produced a smoke that caused strange dreams and visions. The Apache used it rarely and only in the most sacred rituals. Tonight, it would find its way to Fletcher Reed's ranch. As darkness fell, Elena performed a purification ritual, washing her hands and face with water infused with sage. She painted a single line of red ochre across her forehead, the mark of one who walks between worlds. Then she took a small portion of the gray powder and placed it in a leather pouch, which she tied securely to her belt. Outside the night had grown dark, and still, the only sound the distant call of coyotes in the hills. Elena moved silently through the shadows at the edge of town, making her way toward the Reed Ranch on the northern outskirts. The grand house sat on a low hill, its windows glowing with lamplight against the darkness. Elena circled wide, avoiding the main approach, where Fletcher's men would be watching. Instead, she came from the east, where the corral and stables stood. A single ranch hand dozed on a stool outside the barn rifle across his knees. Elena waited patiently until his chin dropped to his chest in deeper sleep, then moved forward, her footsteps silent on the packed earth. The ranch house had several chimneys, including one that vented the main fireplace in Fletcher's study, a room where he often sat late into the night, drinking and brooding. Elena knew the layout of the house from Martha, who had once consulted her about traditional remedies for headaches when the town doctor's treatments had failed. Keeping to the shadows, Elena approached the base of the chimney. From her pouch, she took a handful of the gray powder and cast it into the still glowing embers of the evening fire. The powder ignited instantly, sending a thin, nearly invisible smoke up the chimney and into the study where Fletcher undoubtedly sat. The smoke would cause no physical harm, but it would ensure that Fletcher Reed's sleep, if he found any at all, would be filled with visions from his past. The Apache believed that such dreams forced a person to confront their deepest fears and most hidden shames. "Sleep well, Fletcher Reed," Elena whispered to the night. "May you see Joseph's face in your dreams." Her task completed, she slipped away into the darkness as silent as she had come. In the distance, a coyote howled a lonely sound that seemed to echo the promise of her first day's work. Day one was complete. The horse was taken. The dreams would come. 6 days remained. The second day dawned hot and still, the air thick with the promise of a storm. Elena rose before first light, her dreams filled with horses and warnings from ancestors. Through her small window she could see the red-tinged horizon, a shepherd's warning, as Joseph used to call it. Elena touched the counting cord at her waist, finding the second knot. Day 2, water. After a simple breakfast, she knelt on the packed earth floor and performed her morning ritual. She sprinkled sacred tobacco in the 4 directions and mixed soil from Joseph's grave with water in a wooden bowl. "The earth and water remember, beloved," she whispered, drawing a protective symbol on her forehead. "Today, I remind them of what was stolen." She packed food for Thomas and set out for town, following the path through mesquite and prickly pear. Fletcher would be reeling from the loss of his stallion, his sleep disturbed by the medicine smoke. Today, she would strike at something even more precious, his control of the water that gave him power over the valley. At the jailhouse, Sheriff Warren acknowledged her with barely a glance, his face haggard from a sleepless night. 10 minutes, he said, leading her to the cells. Thomas brightened when he saw her reaching through the bars to touch the bruise on her face where Fletcher had struck her. "It's nothing," Elena assured him, passing the food bundle through. "Have they treated you well?" "Deputy Miller brings extra water when the sheriff isn't looking. He doesn't think I should be here." Elena lowered her voice. Many in town are beginning to question Fletcher's story. "The gold watch, do you know where it is now?" "Fletcher keeps it with him," Thomas whispered. "He wears it on a chain across his vest. He parades what he stole in plain sight, thinking none will challenge him." "Is it true what happened with the horses?" Thomas asked, voice hushed with wonder. Elena smiled slightly. "The earth provides when justice demands it." "What happens today, Mother? You said 7 days." Today I touch his water. By sundown, Fletcher Reed will begin to understand what it means to thirst for justice. Thomas studied her face, a wisdom beyond his 15 years in his dark eyes. You taught me that water is sacred to our people, that it carries memory. Yes, water remembers every hand that has touched it, every life it has sustained, and every drop that has been stolen. Elena placed her hand over his, where it gripped the cell bars. The earth protects its own Shiazi. Have faith. A flicker of doubt crossed Thomas's face. But if they hang me before the 7 days are done, they won't, Elena said with quiet certainty. Thomas straightened his shoulders. I'm not afraid to die like father if I must. The simple courage in his words nearly broke Elena's heart. Joseph would be proud of the man you're becoming, but he would want you to live, to carry his name forward. As she left the jailhouse, Samuel Hawkins was waiting across the street. Mrs. Ravenwing, he greeted her. A word, if you have time. They walked toward the edge of town, away from curious ears. The morning heat was already building, shimmering above the dusty street. There's talk all over town about Reed's missing stallion, Samuel said. His men tore apart 3 homesteads yesterday, roughed up old Jim Parsons pretty badly. Parsons has no love for Reed. His well ran dry last year when Fletcher diverted the creek. That's actually what I wanted to discuss. Samuel lowered his voice. I've been asking questions about Reed's water rights. The original grants had some irregularities. What kind of irregularities? The kind that involved dead men and forged signatures. Silver Creek originally ran through communal grazing land. Reed ended up with exclusive rights after 3 neighboring ranchers died in a span of 2 years. 3 deaths, Elena murmured. All convenient for Fletcher Reed. And there's more. Father Timothy mentioned that Reed donates generously to the church, but only after the old priest died. The church records from before are missing entire sections. Joseph suspected as much. He believed Fletcher had altered or destroyed records that contradicted his claims. She met Samuel's gaze. What do you plan to do with this information? I wired an old army friend who works for the territorial governor. Asked him to check Reed's military records. Be careful, Mr. Hawkins. Fletcher Reed has powerful friends beyond this valley. So did I once upon a time. Samuel's smile was grim. Some of them still owe me favors. At the small church, Father Timothy greeted Elena warmly. I've been praying for Thomas. Thank you, Father. I hoped I might look at the church records. My husband always said the history of this town is written in your books. Of course, though I fear you'll find them incomplete. Many pages were removed before my time here. In the church office, Elena examined the parish records, finding an entry from 20 years ago. Land grant dispute resolved between Elijah Mathers and Fletcher Reed. Reed awarded northern section, including water rights to Silver Creek. Mathers's protest formally withdrawn following his sudden death. She continued searching, finding 2 more disputes over water rights with similar outcomes. In the margins of one entry, someone had written, "May God judge what man cannot." By noon, Elena had compiled a list of 6 suspicious incidents, all following the same pattern. She carefully copied the details onto a sheet of paper. Find what you were looking for? Father Timothy asked as she emerged. More than I expected. Tell me, Father, do you believe the earth remembers the blood spilled upon it? The priest considered carefully. The Bible tells us that Abel's blood cried out from the ground after Cain slew him. So yes, in a way, I believe it does. He studied her face. But vengeance belongs to the Lord, Elena. And if the Lord chooses to work through human hands, she asked, Father Timothy sighed. Then those hands must be guided by justice, not hatred. As she left the church, Elena noticed a commotion around the town well. Sheriff Warren stood looking down into its depths, his face troubled. Rose Walker hurried over to Elena, her gray hair escaping its neat bun. "Something's wrong with the water," she explained. "Came out brown this morning, smelling like sulfur." "That's unfortunate," Elena said, careful to keep her expression neutral. "Fletcher's already sent his water wagon down, charging double what he did yesterday." "Perhaps the recent tremors disturbed the underground spring." "Perhaps," Rose said, eyeing Elena speculatively. "Or perhaps it's part of what you promised Fletcher Reed. 7 days, wasn't it?" "The earth provides justice in its own way, Mrs. Walker." Rose smiled. "Well, whatever's happening, it couldn't happen to a more deserving man. That monster has controlled this town through its water for too long." A commotion near the well interrupted their conversation. The blacksmith had drawn up a bucket of water that was murky brownish-red with an oily sheen. The smell made several people step back in disgust. "It's like blood," someone murmured. "The water smells like blood." "It's just minerals from the ground," Sheriff Warren insisted. "Probably stirred up by those tremors last week." But the damage was done. Whispers had begun. Whispers of Elena's promise of the earth, remembering of justice coming after 7 days. By midday, citizens lined up at Fletcher's water wagon, grudgingly paying his exorbitant prices. Fletcher himself had come to town, his satisfaction evident despite the shadows under his eyes and the slight tremor in his hands. Samuel Hawkins watched from the shade of the gunsmith's shop, recognizing the subtle signs of a man coming undone. "Nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs," muttered Jenkins the gunsmith. "Town's talking about that Apache woman's promise. 7 days, she said." He eyed Samuel speculatively. "You believe in that Indian magic?" Samuel considered his answer. "I've seen things during my time with the Apache scouts that I can't explain. But I believe more in human justice than spiritual vengeance, and Fletcher Reed has a lot to answer for." "Joseph Ravenwing wasn't the first to die convenient-like after crossing Reed," Jenkins agreed. "There was old Mathers before him, and the Mexican fellow Santiago Vela was found dead in his barn with a broken neck. Ruled an accident." Jenkins raised an eyebrow. "You've been doing your homework." Their conversation halted as Fletcher strode toward the general store where Elena had appeared. He loomed over her. "Convenient, isn't it? Town well goes bad just when I happen to have water to sell." Elena met his gaze calmly. "The earth remembers Fletcher. Every drop you've stolen, every life you've taken to control the water. You think I don't know what you're doing? These little tricks won't work on me." "They aren't tricks," Elena replied evenly. "Day 2 I'd touch your water." Fletcher's hand moved to Joseph's gold watch in his pocket. "You and your Indian superstitions. Did you sleep well last night, Fletcher? Or did the dreams come?" Samuel couldn't hear Fletcher's response, but he saw the man's face pale visibly. For a moment, genuine fear flashed across his features before he masked it with a sneer. Inside the general store, Martha Reed had witnessed the confrontation from behind a display of canned goods. She had come to town on a rare errand without Fletcher's supervision, seizing the chance to purchase thread and exchange a few words with Rose Walker. From her hiding place, Martha had been struck by Elena's composure in the face of Fletcher's intimidation. When Fletcher stalked off toward the saloon, Martha found herself face to face with Elena, who had entered the store. "Mrs. Reed," Elena acknowledged with a slight nod. "Mrs. Ravenwing." Martha returned her voice barely above a whisper. Martha was acutely aware of her appearance, the high collar concealing bruises, the long sleeves hiding finger marks on her arms, the carefully applied powder covering the remnants of a black eye. Elena selected a small packet of salt. "I heard you were unwell last month. The headaches again." "Yes, Dr. Patterson's powders didn't help much." "I could prepare something for you. The wild willow bark is stronger this season." It was a careful dance, two women speaking of innocent remedies while communicating something more dangerous beneath. "I would appreciate that," Martha said. "I could come to your cabin tomorrow. Fletcher will be at the North Range all day." Elena nodded, understanding the risk Martha was taking. "I'll be home after noon." As Martha turned to leave, Elena spoke again, voice pitched for Martha's ears alone. "The gold watch Fletcher wears, it belonged to my husband. Did you know that—" Martha froze. "I suspected. There was an inscription inside. 'To Joseph Ravenwing for valor and loyalty,'" Elena supplied. "From the men of Company B." Martha finished, anguish in her eyes. "I'm so sorry. He told me he won it in a card game." "You are as much his victim as any of us, Martha." Something flickered in Martha's eyes, a spark of the woman she had once been. "Not for much longer," she whispered. "7 days, you said?" "7 days," Elena confirmed. Martha drew herself up. "Then I'll see you tomorrow. There are things you should know, things about Joseph's death, that Fletcher doesn't realize I overheard." Thomas sat alone in his cell as afternoon heat turned the jailhouse into an oven. He had spent the morning observing Sheriff Warren and Deputy Miller, noting their routines and the tension between them. The deputy was young, with a kindness that suggested he hadn't been in town long enough for Fletcher's influence to corrupt him. Several times he had brought extra water or exchanged words with Thomas. Now Thomas removed a polished stone from his moccasin black as midnight with a single vein of white quartz running through it. His father had given it to him on his 10th birthday. This is a stone of protection," Joseph had explained. "Our people have carried such stones for generations. The white line represents the path of truth, cutting through darkness." Thomas ran his thumb over the smooth surface, drawing comfort from this connection to his father. From his window, he could see people gathered around the town, well gesturing with worried expressions. He smiled, slightly understanding what his mother had done. Day 2. "I touch your water." Elena Ravenwing was fighting for him using the powerful wisdom of their ancestors. Thomas felt proud, but also afraid for her safety. Fletcher Reed was dangerous, especially when threatened. The cell door rattled. Deputy Miller appeared with Samuel Hawkins. "Thomas," Samuel greeted him, "your mother asked me to check on you." Thomas studied the older man warily. "Why would you help us, Mr. Hawkins?" "Your father saved my life once near Coyote Pass, Apache ambush." Samuel tapped his empty sleeve. "Lost this arm later at Antietam, but I never forgot what I owed him." Thomas relaxed slightly. "You knew my father well, not as well as I would have liked, but well enough to know he was a man of honor, and well enough to know his death was no accident." Thomas's eyes widened. Few in town would speak so directly about Fletcher's involvement. "Can you help my mother prove it?" "I'm trying. I've got connections in the territorial government looking into Reed's background. But your mother is fighting this battle her own way." "The 7 days," Thomas nodded. "Today is day 2. "The water," Samuel confirmed. "The town well is fouled. People are paying Reed double for water from his creek." He studied Thomas thoughtfully. "Do you believe your mother can truly affect these things?" Thomas met the veteran's gaze. "My people have always understood that the earth listens to those who respect it. My mother knows how to ask the earth for help. Samuel reached through the bars, placing a small package on Thomas's cot. Brought you something to read. Thomas unwrapped a worn copy of Shakespeare's The Tempest, one of his father's favorites. Your mother mentioned Joseph used to read Shakespeare to you, Samuel explained. Thought you might appreciate that one. Story of justice, long delayed, but finally delivered. As Samuel turned to leave, Thomas called after him. Mr. Hawkins, watch over my mother. Fletcher's men are everywhere. I will, son, Samuel promised, and keep your spirits up. This cell isn't your destiny. After Samuel left, Thomas opened the book, finding a folded paper tucked between its pages with his mother's handwriting, "Be ready. When the storm comes, so does your chance. Trust those who offer help. The earth provides a path." Thomas quickly hid the note in his moccasin alongside the protection stone. Outside, the sky had darkened, the promised storm drawing closer. At his ranch, Fletcher paced his study, whiskey in hand. The dreams from the previous night still clung to him like cobwebs, Joseph Ravenwing's bloodied, accusing face. The town well was contaminated, forcing people to buy his water at inflated prices. Yet instead of triumph, he felt mocked. Day 2, I touch your water. How had she done it? The contamination seemed to come from within the earth itself, just as his stallion had vanished without a trace. Fletcher drained his whiskey and hurled the glass into the fireplace. The crash brought his foreman Hayes running. Sir, everything all right? Fletcher straightened. Gather the men. I want Elena Ravenwing watched day and night. Hayes nodded uneasily. And the boy? Some of the men are talking, saying maybe we shouldn't hang a child. Fletcher's eyes turned cold. The boy hangs as planned. Make sure everyone knows questioning me will be unhealthy. When Hayes left, Fletcher withdrew a small leather pouch from his desk drawer. Inside were items taken from an old Apache medicine man, a stone, a carved figure, an eagle feather, and herbs tied with red thread. He arranged them on his desk, as if for protection. Just superstition, he muttered, even as he carefully positioned the eagle feather to point east. Yet his hand shook as he poured another whiskey. Fletcher Reed, born Frank Reddick, a deserter from the Union Army, had built his empire through forgery and strategic violence. His carefully constructed persona had served him well until Joseph Ravenwing discovered the truth while surveying the northern boundary of Reed's property. Joseph had found the original Spanish land grants with their unaltered boundaries. He had uncovered correspondence that mentioned Frank Reddick's arrival in the territory. Most damning, he had obtained military records revealing the truth about Fletcher Reed's desertion. Fletcher had silenced the Apache scout, arranging an accident at Copper Canyon. It should have ended there with Joseph's evidence buried alongside his body. But somehow, Elena knew. The certainty in her eyes when she promised 7 days of justice had shaken him to his core. 7 days, she had said. 2 were nearly gone. 5 remained. As the sun began to set, Elena made her way to Silver Creek, following it upstream to a spring that bubbled from the rocky hillside above Fletcher's property. Joseph had shown her this place in the early days of their marriage, explaining how water flowed underground before emerging as the headwaters of Silver Creek. Elena knelt beside the small pool. From her pouch, she took herbs, sage, juniper, peyote, and others known only to Apache healers. She sprinkled them on the water's surface. To ei ina ate, she prayed in Apache. Water is life. Water remembers. She took a small pottery bowl and filled it with spring water, adding a pinch of red ochre and drops of bitter essence from desert plants. These would not harm those who drank the water, but would make it taste slightly off, a reminder that something was wrong with Fletcher's supposedly pure spring. Grandfather Earth, let your waters speak truth. Let them carry the memory of what has been done here. As Elena completed her ritual, the wind picked up suddenly. In the distance, thunder rumbled the storm approaching faster. She could feel the electricity in the air, the promise of rain after months of drought. Perfect weather for what would come next. Day 3, I touch your sleep. A twig snapped nearby. Elena froze her hand, alright, moving to her knife. Another crack, followed by boots on stone. She backed toward a boulder's shadow. A figure emerged from the trees, silhouetted against the twilight. Samuel Hawkins. "Mrs. Ravenwing," he called softly. "It's just me." Elena relaxed slightly. "You shouldn't be here. Fletcher's men patrol these hills." "I know. I avoided 2 of them." He glanced at the spring. "So this is part of day 2. You followed me. I was concerned for your safety. What did you put in the water?" "Nothing that will harm anyone. Only herbs to help people remember this water once belonged to everyone." Samuel nodded. "I received a telegram this afternoon." My friend confirmed what I suspected. Fletcher Reed's military records are inconsistent with his claims. He was never at Gettysburg or Antietam. Where was he? He served briefly but was discharged for conduct unbecoming after less than a year. There were allegations of theft from fellow officers and violence against civilian women. Joseph believed Fletcher had fabricated most of his past, perhaps even his family name. There's no record of a Fletcher Reed from the background he claims. My friend thinks our Mr. Reed might have arrived in Arizona under a different name entirely. A man with secrets is a man with weaknesses. They began making their way down the hillside, Samuel moving carefully over the rocky terrain. Thunder crashed closer now, and lightning split the sky. "Your husband bridged 2 worlds," Samuel ventured. "Yet he chose to live in town rather than return to the reservation." "Why?" Elena considered her answer. "Joseph believed the future belonged to those who could walk in both worlds without losing themselves in either. He wanted Thomas to know the stories and ways of the Apache, but also to read Shakespeare and understand mathematics." She looked up at the sky. "He used to say that the reservation was a cage, built by those who feared what they didn't understand. He refused to be caged." "He was a remarkable man," Samuel said softly. "Every day I wish for more time with him." As they reached the outskirts of town, Elena paused. "I must prepare for tonight. Day 3 begins at midnight." "What happens tonight?" "Fletcher Reed will face the ghosts of his past," Elena said. "Not in dreams, but in the waking world." The saloon was crowded that evening, men seeking refuge from the approaching storm. The strange events of the past 2 days had left the townsfolk on edge, rumors spreading like wildfire. "I heard she can speak to animals," whispered a ranch hand at the bar. "That's how she got them horses to come yesterday." At a corner table, 4 of Fletcher's men nursed whiskeys, their conversation tense. They had spent the day searching for the missing stallion without success. "Boss is losing his grip," muttered Deacon, a scarred man. "Never seen him so spooked." "It's that Indian woman," replied Bridges, a young cowhand. "Something ain't natural about her." "You believe that superstitious nonsense?" scoffed Carson, an older hand. "Don't know what to believe anymore." Deacon shrugged. "But I know what I saw at the well today. Water red as blood." Hayes Fletcher's foreman silenced them with a sharp look. "Keep your voices down." "She said she'd touch his sleep," Carson murmured. "What does that even mean?" The men exchanged uneasy glances, none willing to voice their growing fear that perhaps Elena Ravenwing's power was greater than they had imagined. At the bar, Samuel listened to the conversations swirling around him. The mood was different tonight. Fear mingled with a strange anticipation, as if the town sensed a shift in the balance of power. Sheriff Warren arrived, ordering a whiskey and nodding curtly to Samuel. "Quite a day, Sheriff," Samuel observed. "First the well, now a storm, almost biblical." Warren grunted, tossing back his drink. "Nothing biblical about a contaminated well, just bad timing. And the horses yesterday, bad timing too." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "You'd do well to mind your business, Hawkins. Seems like anyone who crosses Fletcher Reed meets with unfortunate accidents. Joseph Ravenwing, Elijah Mathers, Santiago Velez." Warren leaned closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Reed isn't just dangerous, he's connected. Territorial judges, politicians in Santa Fe, even a senator back east. Cross him, and you won't just disappear, you'll be erased." "Sounds like you're speaking from experience." Warren drained his second whiskey. "Just a friendly warning. This isn't your fight. It became my fight when Reed tried to hang an innocent boy. Just like it should have been yours." Warren paused, his shoulders slumping slightly before he continued into the storm-lashed night. Samuel remained at the bar. The sheriff's warning had confirmed his suspicions. Reed's power extended beyond Redemption Creek. But Warren was also afraid of whatever Elena had set in motion. Outside, the storm broke in earnest. Rain lashed against the windows, driven by howling wind. Lightning flashed continuously, followed by crashes of thunder that made the building's timbers creak. At the Reed Ranch, Fletcher paced his study, staring out at the raging storm. The rain beat against the windows with unnatural force, and wind howled around the eaves. Each lightning flash illuminated the room in harsh white light, followed by darkness that seemed deeper than before. He had drunk half a bottle of whiskey, but it had done nothing to steady his nerves. If anything, it had heightened his awareness of every creak, every shadow. Day 3. I touch your sleep. The previous night's dreams still haunted him. Joseph Ravenwing's bloody face, his accusing eyes, his final words. "The earth remembers Reddick. It will come for you." Fletcher shuddered. Joseph had called him by his real name, Frank Reddick, deserter, thief-murderer. A violent crash of thunder made him jump, spilling whiskey. The lamps flickered and dimmed as if affected by the storm. "Hayes!" he shouted, but no response came. The ranch hands were in the bunkhouse. His wife Martha had not returned from town. Fletcher was alone, surrounded by shadows and memories he'd spent years trying to bury. The lamps flickered again, then went out, completely plunging the study into darkness, broken only by flashes of lightning. Fletcher fumbled for matches, striking one and holding it to the nearest lamp. The flame caught, but burned with an eerie bluish light that cast strange elongated shadows across the room. A gust of wind slammed against the window with such force that the glass cracked, letting in a spray of rain and a fine grayish powder that scattered across the desk. Fletcher recognized it as the same substance that had filled his study the previous night just before the dreams began. "No," he whispered, backing toward the door. The blue flame in the lamp grew taller, its light reflecting in the raindrops that now spattered the floor. In each droplet, Fletcher saw a tiny image of Joseph Ravenwing's face, multiplied infinitely across the room. A trick of the light, he told himself frantically. An illusion caused by the storm and whiskey. But even as he reached for the door handle, he knew it was more than that. The door swung open before Fletcher could touch it, revealing not the hallway beyond, but a view of Copper Canyon, the place where Joseph Ravenwing had died. Sunlight bathed the red rocks in golden light, so different from the storm-lashed night that should have been there, and standing in the canyon looking directly at Fletcher was Joseph Ravenwing. "No," Fletcher moaned, stumbling backward. "You're dead. I killed you." "The earth remembers," Joseph said, his voice carrying clearly. "It remembers every drop of blood spilled upon it." Fletcher slammed the door shut, his breath coming in ragged gasps. When he turned back, the blue flame had spread to every lamp, filling the study with ghostly light. The rainwater on the floor had formed a perfect circle around him, and then he saw them translucent figures taking shape in the corners. Elijah Mathers, the old rancher, who had drowned in his well. Santiago Velez, found with a broken neck in his barn. The old Apache medicine man, whose sacred items now sat on Fletcher's desk. One by one, they stepped forward, their faces showing the injuries that had killed them. "You're not real," Fletcher shouted. "None of you are real." A new figure appeared, a young woman in a blood-stained dress, her throat bearing marks of strangulation. Fletcher recoiled in horror, recognizing Sarah Mitchell, a farmer's daughter in Missouri, who had threatened to expose his desertion. His first murder. "How can you know about her?" he screamed. "No one knows about her." "The earth remembers," came Joseph's voice again. "Blood calls to blood." Fletcher lunged for his desk drawer, pulling out his revolver. His hands shook violently as he aimed it at the spectral figures. "Stay back," he warned, voice cracking. "I'll shoot." The ghosts continued their slow advance. Fletcher fired wildly, the gunshots deafeningly loud. The bullets passed harmlessly through the apparitions lodging in the walls and furniture. Sobbing, Fletcher emptied his revolver. As the last shot echoed, a blinding flash of lightning was followed by a deafening crack of thunder. The window shattered completely, admitting a torrent of rain and wind that extinguished the blue flames. In the sudden darkness, Fletcher felt cold hands on his shoulders, his arms, his face, the touch of the dead. He screamed a sound of pure terror that no one heard above the howling storm. When lightning flashed again, Fletcher Reed was alone. The ghosts had vanished. The rain circle had disappeared. The blue flames were gone. Only the shattered window and bullet holes remained as evidence of what had occurred, or what he believed had occurred. Fletcher sank to his knees, his empty revolver still clutched in his trembling hand. For the first time in 20 years, he felt the full weight of his crimes. The carefully constructed facade of Fletcher Reed was crumbling, revealing the frightened, guilty Frank Reddick beneath. "4 days left," he whispered. "God help me." Miles away, Elena sat cross-legged before a small ceremonial fire. Her eyes were closed, her breathing slow and regular, her body motionless except for her lips, which moved in silent prayer. Before her lay objects of power, Joseph's pipe, an eagle feather, a bowl of water from the spring, and a small clay figure resembling Fletcher Reed. Around the figure she had sprinkled herbs that induced visions and heightened guilt. Through the ancient practices of her people, through her connection to the earth and its spirits, Elena had reached across the distance and touched Fletcher's sleep, preventing him from finding any rest this night. The smoke from her ceremonial fire had carried her will to Fletcher's ranch on the storm winds. The rain had delivered the vision-inducing herbs to his study. The lightning had provided the energy needed to manifest the apparition's projections of Fletcher's own guilty conscience, given form by Elena's medicine. As the storm began to abate, Elena opened her eyes. She felt drained, but also grimly satisfied. Day 3 had accomplished its purpose. Fletcher Reed's confidence was shattered, his grip on sanity beginning to slip. The careful edifice of lies he had built over 20 years was crumbling one day at a time. She extinguished the fire and gathered the sacred objects. Then she untied the third knot on her counting cord, letting it fall loose. 4 knots remained. 4 days until justice would be complete. Day 4. I touch your name. Tomorrow the people of Redemption Creek would learn the truth about the man who had ruled them through fear. Tomorrow Fletcher Reed would cease to exist, replaced by the criminal Frank Reddick, and Thomas would be one day closer to freedom. Outside, the storm's fury had passed, leaving behind a gentle rain. Elena stepped onto her porch, breathing in the scent of wet earth and desert plants. "The earth remembers," she whispered to the darkness, "and so do I." I'll analyze this excerpt from 7 Days of Justice and provide feedback on its strengths and weaknesses, followed by a revised 1,000-word version that addresses the issues identified. The dawn of the 4th day broke over Redemption Creek with a clarity that only comes after a powerful storm. The sky stretched endless and blue, washed clean of dust and haze. Puddles dotted the rutted main street, reflecting the morning light like scattered mirrors. A hush lay over the town, as if the violence of the previous night's tempest had left everyone and everything exhausted. Elena Ravenwing stood at her cabin door, watching as the rising sun turned dewdrops on sage and creosote to diamond fire. She had slept little, her body still recovering from the powerful medicine work she had performed during the storm. Such ceremonies always exacted a price from the practitioner. Today she felt it in her bones, in the slight tremor of her hands, in the heaviness of her eyelids. But there was no time for rest. Today marked the halfway point in her 7 days of justice. Day 4, I touch your name. She turned back into her cabin, moving to the small altar in the corner where her counting cord lay beside Joseph's relics. 3 knots had been untied, their loosened strands hanging free like spoken promises. 4 remained pulled tight and waiting. Elena ran her fingers over them, feeling the smooth leather warm beneath her touch. Today, the truth comes to light, beloved, she whispered to Joseph's memory. Today, your murderer's lies begin to unravel. From a wooden chest, Elena withdrew a packet of papers carefully wrapped in oilskin to protect them from moisture. These were the copies of documents Joseph had collected before his death. Land records, military rosters, territorial correspondence. Not the originals which had disappeared when Joseph died, but copies he had carefully made and entrusted to Elena for safekeeping. As she prepared to leave, a rider approached Samuel Hawkins, recognizable by his characteristic one-armed posture in the saddle. "Mrs. Ravenwing," Samuel greeted her, dismounting awkwardly, but with practiced ease. "There's been developments. Fletcher Reed was found this morning, half out of his mind, babbling about ghosts and shooting up his study." Elena's expression remained carefully neutral. The earth brings nightmares to those who have earned them. His foreman Hayes is telling everyone Reed took ill with fever after getting soaked in the storm. Samuel's weathered face showed a hint of a smile. But the ranch hands who found him are saying different. They're saying he was screaming names Mathers Velez and others. "The dead speak loudest in the hours before dawn," Elena said softly. "What else?" Samuel handed her a yellow telegram. "Records confirm Reed is Frank Reddick. Stop deserted, Union Army, 1862. Stop, wanted Missouri for murder of Sarah Mitchell. Stop, official inquiry ordered. Stop, governor sending marshal Friday. Stop, Friday," Elena murmured. Day 6. Samuel studied her face. "You don't seem surprised. Joseph knew most of this already." She folded the telegram carefully. "This only confirms what we suspected." "There's more," Samuel said, his voice lowering, though no one was near enough to hear. "Martha Reed left town this morning, supposedly to visit her sister in Tucson, but she stopped at the boarding house first and left a package with Rose Walker." for you." Elena's eyes widened slightly. Did Fletcher know she was leaving? No. According to Rose, Martha left while Fletcher was still indisposed. "We should go to town," Elena said. "There's much to do today." The town was already buzzing with rumors when Elena and Samuel arrived. Fletcher Reed's nocturnal breakdown had spread through Redemption Creek with the speed of a grass fire, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Rose Walker met them at the door of her boarding house, her gray hair escaping its pins as usual. "About time you showed up," she said briskly. "I've got half the town in my parlor waiting to hear what you're going to tell them." Inside the parlor, Elena was surprised to find not just the town's malcontents, but several of its more prominent citizens. Father Timothy sat near the window. Jenkins, the gunsmith, occupied a chair in the corner. The blacksmith and his wife stood by the fireplace. Even Dr. Patterson, who rarely involved himself in town politics, was present. And at the back of the room, nearly hidden behind a potted fern, sat Deputy Miller, looking distinctly uncomfortable to be there while on duty. Rose clapped her hands for attention. "Most of you know Mrs. Ravenwing and Mr. Hawkins. They've got something important to share about Fletcher Reed." All eyes turned to Elena, who suddenly felt the weight of what she was about to do. For 5 years, she had lived quietly, swallowing her grief and rage, protecting her son, while planning for this moment. Now that it had arrived, she found herself momentarily speechless. Samuel sensed her hesitation and stepped forward. "Many of you have known for years that something wasn't right about Fletcher Reed, about how he got his land, his water rights, his power over this town. What some of you may not know," Samuel continued, "is that Fletcher Reed isn't even his real name." Elena found her voice. "5 years ago, my husband, Joseph Ravenwing, discovered the truth while surveying the northern boundary of Reed's property for the Territorial Land Office." She opened her bag and withdrew the oilskin packet. Joseph made copies of everything he found: land records that had been falsified, military rosters that showed Reed's real identity, correspondence that revealed his crimes in Missouri before he came here. "What crimes?" someone called out. "Murder, desertion from the Union Army during the war, theft, fraud. And who is he really, this man we've known as Fletcher Reed?" asked Father Timothy. "His real name is Frank Reddick," Samuel answered, holding up the telegram. "Wanted in Missouri since 1862 for the murder of a young woman named Sarah Mitchell." The room erupted in shocked conversation. Elena waited for it to quiet before continuing. "Joseph was going to take his evidence to the territorial governor. The day after he told me of his plans, he was found dead at the bottom of Copper Canyon." Her voice remained steady, though the pain of those memories still cut deep. "Fletcher Reed, Frank Reddick, murdered my husband to silence him just as he had silenced others who stood in his way." Elena spread the copied documents on Rose's dining table. The townsfolk gathered around, examining the paper's territorial maps showing altered boundary lines, a military discharge record for Frank Reddick, noting conduct unbecoming, and suspected desertion, a wanted notice from Missouri with a crude sketch that, despite the artist's limited skill, bore a clear resemblance to a younger Fletcher Reed. "I've sent these copies to the territorial governor," Samuel added. "He's ordered an official inquiry and is sending a marshal. They'll arrive on Friday." "Friday," Rose echoed. "Day 6. What happens next?" the blacksmith asked. "Reed still has men loyal to him. He still controls the sheriff." "Today we touch his name," Elena replied. "We make sure everyone in Redemption Creek knows who Fletcher Reed really is and what he's done. We break the silence that has protected him." As the meeting continued, plans were made for spreading the word. Jenkins would tell the stage driver who would carry the news to neighboring settlements. Father Timothy would write to his fellow clergy. Even Dr. Patterson agreed to contact medical colleagues who might have treated Frank Reddick during the war. By the time the gathering dispersed, Elena felt the shift in the town's mood. Fear still lingered, but it was no longer directed solely at her and her Apache ways. Now that fear was turning toward Fletcher Reed. "It's working," Samuel murmured as they left the boarding house. "The town is turning against him." "Yes," Elena agreed. "But he is most dangerous now, like a wounded predator. We must be careful." They parted ways, Samuel heading to the telegraph office, Elena toward the jailhouse to see Thomas. Deputy Miller was at the desk when Elena entered the jailhouse. "Mrs. Ravenwing," he acknowledged her, standing quickly. "Here to see Thomas," Elena nodded. "How is he today?" "Fine, ma'am. I gave him extra blankets after the storm. It got cold in the cells." The young deputy hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "The sheriff's out at Reed's ranch. Reed sent for him early this morning. Sounded urgent." "May I see my son?" she asked. Thomas was seated on his cot, reading the copy of Shakespeare that Samuel had brought him. He looked up when he heard footsteps, his face brightening at the sight of his mother. "You're all right," he said, relief evident in his voice. "I was worried during the storm." Elena smiled. "I'm fine, Shiazi. And you? The storm didn't frighten you." Thomas shook his head. "I watched it through the window. It was powerful." He lowered his voice. "I felt Grandfather Earth speaking." Elena nodded, understanding what he meant. The Apache believed that powerful storms were manifestations of the Earth's voice, especially when they came after long droughts. "Something happened to Fletcher Reed last night," Thomas continued, still speaking quietly. "I heard the deputy and sheriff talking this morning. They said he was found raving, shooting at shadows." "Day 3, Elena confirmed. "I touched his sleep." Thomas's eyes widened slightly. "The medicine smoke on the wind." "Yes, it carried visions to him not of my making, but of his own guilt. The faces of those he has wronged." "Including father, especially your father," Elena said softly. Thomas's expression hardened. "Good. He should see father's face every time he closes his eyes." Elena reached through the bars to touch her son's hand. "Today is day 4. I touch his name. By sunset, everyone in this town will know who Fletcher Reed really is." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening, followed by raised voices. Elena recognized Sheriff Warren's irritated tones, followed by Samuel Hawkins's calmer response. "I need to go," she told Thomas. "Remember what I said. Be ready." She found Samuel and the sheriff in a tense standoff at the front desk. "Mrs. Ravenwing," the sheriff acknowledged her coldly. "Your visit's over. Time to go." "Is there a problem, Sheriff?" she asked, noting the way his hand hovered near his gun. "No problem, except people spreading lies about respected citizens," Warren snapped. "Mr. Reed is considering legal action against those participating in this slander campaign." "Truth is an absolute defense against slander charges," Samuel pointed out mildly. Warren's face darkened further. "Get out, both of you, and consider yourselves warned." As they walked toward the newspaper office, Elena felt a familiar prickle at the back of her neck, the sensation of being watched. Casually, she glanced around, spotting one of Fletcher's ranch hands loitering outside the barber shop, his attention too deliberately focused elsewhere. "We're being followed," she murmured to Samuel. He nodded almost imperceptibly. "I noticed. One of Reed's men, Deacon, I think they call him. There will be others." The newspaper office was a narrow building wedged between the general store and a vacant lot. A bell jangled as they entered, announcing their presence to the thin, bespectacled man bent over a desk cluttered with papers. "Mr. Hawkins," he greeted Samuel, then eyed Elena with undisguised curiosity. "Mrs. Ravenwing, isn't it? What brings you to the Chronicle?" "A story you'll want to print, Marcus," Samuel replied, "about Fletcher Reed's true identity." Wright's eyebrows shot up. "True identity? What are you talking about?" Elena placed the oilskin packet on the editor's desk. "Fletcher Reed is really Frank Reddick, a deserter from the Union Army, and a wanted murderer from Missouri. These papers prove it." Wright stared at the packet, then back at Elena. That's a serious accusation. Reed owns half this valley. He's the most powerful man in the county. He's also a fraud and a killer," Samuel said bluntly. "The governor's sending a marshal to arrest him. They'll be here Friday." Wright adjusted his spectacles and leaned forward to examine the papers. "These look genuine," he admitted. "But they're copies. The originals disappeared when Reed murdered my husband to keep him from exposing the truth." Elena finished for him. For the next hour, Elena and Samuel worked with Marcus Wright to craft the story that would expose Fletcher Reed to the entire region. By the time they finished, Wright was practically vibrating with enthusiasm. "This will be a special edition," he declared. "I'll have my boy distribute it first thing tomorrow morning, instead of waiting for the regular afternoon delivery." "Be careful," Samuel warned. "Reed still has men loyal to him. They might try to stop the paper from circulating." Elena reached into her bag and withdrew a small clay pot of red ochre. Dipping her finger into the red earth, she drew a protective symbol on the printing press. "What's that?" Wright asked, watching with fascination. "Protection," Elena replied simply. "The earth safeguards truth-tellers." While Elena and Samuel worked with the newspaper editor, Fletcher Reed paced the study of his ranch house like a caged animal. The room was in shambles, shattered glass on the floor, bullet holes in the walls, papers scattered everywhere. His hands shook as he poured himself another whiskey, spilling half of it on the desk. The faces wouldn't leave him. All night they had come one after another. Mathers Velas, the Mitchell girl from Missouri, others whose names he'd forgotten. And Joseph Ravenwing always. Ravenwing, his dark eyes accusing, his mouth moving in silent condemnation. Fletcher drained the glass, feeling the liquor burn a path down his throat. It didn't help. Nothing helped. Even in daylight, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move and shift, forming shapes that vanished when he turned to look directly at them. Martha had left him. His loyal, frightened, submissive wife had finally found the courage to flee. He'd discovered her absence only when Hayes had mentioned casually that Mrs. Reed's personal items were missing from the dressing table. A search of the house had confirmed it. Clothes gone, jewelry gone, the small locked box where she kept her private papers gone. She knew. Somehow she knew about Ravenwing, about Missouri, about everything. Fletcher slammed his fist on the desk. 5 days ago, everything had been under control. His position secure, his past safely buried, his future bright with the promise of even more power, more land, more respect. Then that witch had spoken her curse at the gallows, and it was as if the very fabric of his life had begun to unravel. Wild horses interrupting the hanging. The town, well, suddenly contaminated. And now the visions, the terrible visions that had nearly driven him mad during the storm. There was a hesitant knock at the door. "Mr. Reed." It was Hayes, his foreman, the only one of his men who had seen him in his current state. "What?" Fletcher snapped. "Sheriff Warren is here to see you, sir." Fletcher ran a trembling hand through his disheveled hair. "Send him in." Warren entered cautiously, his eyes widening slightly at the state of the room. "Jesus, Fletcher, what happened in here?" "Bad night," Fletcher muttered. "Fever dreams. You have news for me?" Warren nodded. "There was a meeting at Rose Walker's boarding house this morning. Half the town was there listening to the Raven Wing woman and Hawkins spin their tales about you." Fletcher's heart raced. "What tales exactly?" "That you're not really Fletcher Reed. That your real name is Frank Reddick, and you're wanted for murder in Missouri." Warren watched him closely. "That you killed Joseph Ravenwing 5 years ago to keep him from exposing you." For a moment, Fletcher couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to close in around him, the shadows stretching toward him like accusing fingers. "It's all lies," he managed finally. "Slander. I'll sue them all." "They claim to have documents," Warren continued. "Military records, land deeds, a wanted poster from Missouri." "Forgeries?" Fletcher said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Has to be." Warren was still studying him, doubt creeping into his eyes. "They're taking their evidence to the newspaper. The Chronicle will run the story tomorrow." Tomorrow, day 5 of the witch's countdown. Day 5, I touch your land. Fletcher felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. His land, the ranch, the water rights, the grazing contracts, all built on carefully constructed lies, on falsified documents, on the strategic elimination of those who asked too many questions. "Stop them," he ordered. "Arrest them for slander." "On what grounds, Fletcher, if they have documents?" "I said, arrest them." Fletcher's voice rose to a shout. "You work for me, Warren. Don't forget that." The sheriff's face hardened. "I work for the county, not for you. And if what they're saying is true—" "Get out!" Fletcher snarled. "Get out of my house!" When Warren had gone, Fletcher returned to his desk and pulled open the bottom drawer. Inside was a small leather-bound book, his real account book, not the one his bookkeeper maintained for official purposes. This one contained the truth names of men he'd bribed or threatened, transactions that existed in no public record locations of evidence he'd hidden or destroyed. And on the last page, a list of those who had died to protect his secrets. Fletcher stared at the names, his vision blurring. How had it come to this? He'd only wanted what any man wanted: success, respect, power. He'd built something from nothing, transformed worthless land into a profitable enterprise, brought civilization to a savage territory. But now it was all crumbling just as the witch had promised. Day by day, knot by knot, she was unraveling the life he'd so carefully constructed. Fletcher slammed the book shut and reached for his rifle. There was only one way to stop this now. One final solution to the problem of Elena Ravenwing and her 7 days of justice. As the late afternoon sun cast long shadows down the main street, Elena felt a deep satisfaction. Day 4 was unfolding exactly as she had planned. By tomorrow morning, Fletcher Reed's true name and crimes would be known throughout Redemption Creek and beyond. "We should get you somewhere safe for the night," Samuel suggested. "Reed's men are still watching." Elena nodded. "Rose Walker's boarding house. She has a room prepared." They had taken only a few steps when the sound of galloping hooves drew their attention. A rider was approaching fast from the direction of Reed's ranch, pushing his horse dangerously hard. As he drew nearer, they recognized Hayes Fletcher's foreman. He reined in sharply in front of the sheriff's office, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. His expression was grim as he disappeared inside. "That doesn't look good," Samuel murmured. "No," Elena agreed. "Something has happened." They waited, watching the jailhouse door. Minutes later, Sheriff Warren emerged with Hayes, both men moving with urgent purpose toward the saloon. Samuel touched Elena's arm. "Stay here. I'll find out what's happening." He crossed the street and entered the saloon after the sheriff and Hayes. Elena remained where she was, her senses alert for any danger. The town seemed to hold its breath around her as if waiting for something momentous to occur. Samuel returned quickly, his face grave. "Reed's missing. Left the ranch while Hayes was in town getting supplies. Took his best horse and a rifle. No one knows where he's gone." A chill ran through Elena, despite the warm afternoon. "Thomas," she said immediately. "He'll go after Thomas." They hurried to the jailhouse, finding Deputy Miller alone at the desk. "Where's Thomas Ravenwing?" Samuel demanded without preamble. Miller looked up, startled. "In his cell. Where else?" "Check," Elena urged. "Now." Something in her voice convinced the deputy. He grabbed the cell keys and led them quickly to the back. The relief that flooded Elena when she saw Thomas safe in his cell was so intense she nearly staggered. "What's wrong?" Thomas asked, rising from his cot at the sight of their concerned faces. "Fletcher Reed has disappeared from his ranch," Samuel explained. "We were worried he might come here." Thomas's eyes widened, but he showed no fear. "He's running. He knows what's coming." "Or he's hunting," Elena said softly. "Sheriff Warren knows about our meeting at the boarding house. He would have told Fletcher who was there." A sudden realization struck Elena. "Martha," she whispered. "He's going after Martha." The pieces fell into place with terrible clarity. Martha had left that morning for Tucson. If Fletcher had learned of her departure, if he suspected she had shared what she knew about Joseph's murder. "The Tucson road," Elena said urgently. "He'll try to intercept her before she reaches safety." "I'll go," Samuel offered immediately. "We both will," Elena countered. "Martha knows me. She'll trust me." Miller handed her his spare revolver. "You might need this, ma'am." As they prepared to leave, Elena approached Thomas's cell one last time. "Stay alert," she told him. "Deputy Miller will watch over you, but be ready for anything." Thomas nodded solemnly. "Day 4, he said. "His name is exposed, and now he runs like the coward he is." Outside they mounted quickly, Samuel on his own horse, Elena on Miller's bay gelding. As they rode past the newspaper office, Elena saw Marcus Wright, watching from the window, his face set with new determination as he prepared to print the story that would destroy Fletcher Reed's carefully constructed identity. Day 4 was ending. Fletcher's name had been touched, his lies exposed. But darkness was falling, and somewhere ahead on the Tucson road, a desperate man with nothing left to lose was hunting his final victim. The Tucson road wound through harsh country rocky slopes, giving way to stands of mesquite and cactus dry washes that could turn to raging torrents with a single cloudburst ridgelines that provided perfect vantage points for anyone wishing to ambush travelers. Elena and Samuel rode hard, pushing their horses as much as they dared in the failing light. "Martha left this morning," Samuel called over the drumming of hooves. "She'd be making camp by now." Elena nodded. Martha would have had at least a 6-hour head start on Fletcher, but he knew these lands better than anyone. He would be familiar with shortcuts, with places where the road narrowed and forced travelers to slow. About 15 miles from town, the road descended into a narrow canyon, where a small spring created a natural stopping point for travelers. It was the most likely place for Martha to have made camp. Samuel raised his hand, signaling Elena to slow as they approached. They dismounted, leading their horses the final distance on foot. The canyon lay in deep shadow, but a faint glow suggested a banked campfire ahead. "Wait here," Samuel whispered, drawing his revolver. Elena shook her head. "I'll approach from the other side. If Fletcher is there, we can trap him between us." Before Samuel could protest, Elena slipped away into the darkness, moving with the silent grace her people had perfected over generations of hunting and warfare. She circled wide, climbing a rocky slope to gain a better view of the campsite below. What she saw made her blood run cold. Two figures lay motionless near the remains of a small fire. A horse was tethered nearby, while two others lay dead on the ground, shot most likely to prevent any escape. Of Fletcher Reed, there was no sign. Elena scanned the surrounding terrain, every sense alert for danger. A slight movement in the shadows across the canyon caught her eye. Fletcher, it had to be. He was watching, waiting to see who had followed him. Samuel had seen the camp as well. She watched as he approached cautiously, revolver ready. When he reached the clearing and saw the bodies, he knelt quickly to check for signs of life. "They're alive," he called softly. "Unconscious, but alive." Relief washed through Elena. Martha and the blacksmith's son had not yet paid the ultimate price for opposing Fletcher Reed. Then, from the shadows, "Step away from them, Hawkins!" Fletcher Reed emerged from the darkness, rifle aimed at Samuel's back. In the moonlight, he looked like a ghost of himself. Clothes, disheveled face, haggard eyes burning with a feverish light. Samuel turned slowly, keeping his revolver pointed at the ground. "It's over, Reddick. The whole town knows who you are by now. The governor's sending a marshal. Running won't save you." Fletcher's laugh was harsh, unhinged.
You think I don't know that? You think I haven't known this day would come ever since that damned Indian started asking questions about my land grants? Joseph Ravenwing, Samuel said deliberately. Say his name. You murdered him. I did what I had to do. Fletcher's voice rose, echoing off the canyon walls. I built something here, took worthless land, and made it valuable. Brought order to a lawless territory. By stealing, lying, and killing, Samuel countered. There's no honor in what you've built, Abipple Reddick. Where is she, the witch who started all this? I'm here, Frank Reddick. Elena stepped into the moonlight on the ridge above, drawing his attention upward. The use of his real name visibly shook him. You, he snarled. You destroyed everything with your Indian magic and your 7 days of justice. No, Elena replied calmly. You destroyed yourself with your greed and cruelty. I merely revealed what was already there. Fletcher swung his rifle toward her, then back to Samuel, caught between two targets. Neither of you is leaving this canyon alive, nor are they. He gestured toward the unconscious forms of Martha and the blacksmith's son. No witnesses, just like before. There are always witnesses, Elena said. The earth sees everything. The water remembers. The air carries your words to distant ears. Shut up with your superstitious nonsense, Fletcher shouted. You think your Apache spirits protected Joseph. They didn't save him when I put a bullet in his back. They won't save you either. The bald confession hung in the night air. Samuel tensed, ready to move at the first opportunity. Joseph's spirit has been watching you, Frank Reddick, she said softly. Every nightmare, every vision, every shadow that makes you start in fear, that's him, waiting for justice. No, Fletcher moaned, the rifle wavering slightly. No, he's dead. I killed him. The dead are never really gone, Elena continued, her voice hypnotic. They walk beside us. They whisper in our ears. They wait for us in the darkness. As she spoke, a strange stillness fell over the canyon. The wind, which had been gusting fitfully, suddenly died. The moonlight seemed to dim as if clouds had passed before it, though the sky remained clear. Fletcher's eyes darted frantically around the canyon. What are you doing? What is this?
Elena continued her soft chant words in Apache, now ancient words of summoning and remembrance. On the ground, the sand began to stir, though there was no wind. Small eddies formed spiraling upward, catching the moonlight like pale specters rising from the earth. "Jesus Christ," Fletcher whispered, his face white with terror. One of the dust devils grew larger, taking on a vaguely human shape. Others followed, swirling around Fletcher, surrounding him with ghostly forms that brushed against him with cold, gritty fingers. "No!" and he screamed, firing his rifle wildly into the whirling dust. "Get away from me!" Samuel used the distraction to lunge forward, tackling Fletcher to the ground. The rifle discharged once more, the shot going wide before Samuel wrenched it from his hands. For several moments they struggled in the dirt, Fletcher fighting with the desperate strength of a madman. Then abruptly he went limp, his eyes fixed on something behind Samuel. Samuel turned to look. Where the largest dust devil had been, a more solid shadow now stood, a tall, broad-shouldered figure that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. Its features were indistinct, but there was no mistaking the shape of a man. "Joseph," Fletcher whispered, his voice cracking with terror. Elena descended from the ridge, moving to stand beside the shadow figure. "Day 4 is ending, Frank Reddick," she said. "Your name has been touched by truth, exposed to the light. It can no longer shield you." The shadow figure reached out its arm, extending impossibly long, until its hand, or what seemed to be a hand, hovered over Fletcher's chest, directly above his heart. Fletcher whimpered, tears streaming down his dirt-streaked face. "Please," he begged. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to kill him. It was an accident." "Another lie," Elena said coldly. "Your last day approaches, Frank Reddick. Day 7, I touch your blood." "No," he moaned. "No, please. I'll confess. I'll tell the marshal everything. Just don't let him take me." The shadow figure withdrew its hand and seemed to nod once before dissolving back into the night air. The other dust devils followed, collapsing one by one, until the canyon was still once more, with only the soft moans of the wind through the rocks to remind them of what had occurred. Samuel bound Fletcher's hands with a length of rope from his saddlebag. "It's over, Reddick. You've lost." "Did you see him?" Fletcher asked, his voice small and broken. "Did you see Ravenwing?" Samuel and Elena exchanged glances. "I saw dust devils," Samuel said carefully. "Common enough in these canyons." "No," Fletcher insisted. "It was him. It was all of them. All the ones I—" He broke off, shuddering. "The guilty mind creates its own tormentors," Elena said, "just as it did last night in your dreams." While Samuel secured their prisoner, Elena turned her attention to the other victims. Martha Reed was now conscious, sitting up with her back against a saddle, her face pale in the moonlight. The blacksmith's son, Caleb, was also stirring a nasty gash on his temple, but otherwise, apparently, unharmed. "He came out of nowhere," Martha said shakily. "Shot our horses first, then hit Caleb with his rifle butt when he tried to fight back." "And you?" Elena asked gently. Martha touched a bruised cheek. He wanted to know what I'd told people in town. About him. About Joseph's death." Her voice broke. "I was so afraid, Elena. I thought he would kill us both." "But he didn't," Elena said. "He kept you alive to question you further. That was his mistake." By the time they had tended to Martha and Caleb's injuries, dawn was breaking over the eastern mountains. They fashioned a travois for Caleb, who was still dizzy from his head wound, and prepared to return to Redemption Creek. As the sun rose, fully painting the canyon walls with golden light, Elena felt a profound sense of completion. 4 days had passed. 4 knots had been untied from her counting cord. Fletcher Reed Frank Reddick was captured. His true name exposed. His reign of terror ended. The town of Redemption Creek awakened to a transformed world. The Chronicle's special edition had been distributed at first light, just as Marcus Wright had promised. By mid-morning, there wasn't a soul in town who hadn't read the explosive revelations about Fletcher Reed's true identity. Elena watched from the porch of Rose Walker's boarding house as groups of townspeople gathered on street corners, talking in urgent, excited tones, copies of the newspaper passing from hand to hand. Fletcher Reed, now known to all as Frank Reddick, had been locked in the jail's strongest cell under the watchful eye of both Sheriff Warren and Deputy Miller. His wild tales of ghostly apparitions in the canyon had only added to the general conviction that he was a man undone by his own crimes. Samuel approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Special delivery from Rose," he said, handing one to Elena. "Thank you." She sipped the strong, bitter brew gratefully.
Any news from the telegraph office?
"The marshal is definitely coming tomorrow," Samuel confirmed. "And there's more. The governor's sending a judge with him. They want to handle this case quickly, given the unusual circumstances." Elena nodded. The murder of a government surveyor 5 years earlier would normally merit a more extended legal process. But the combination of Fletcher's jailbreak attempt, the attack on Martha and Caleb, and his public confession in the canyon had accelerated matters considerably. "Day 5, Samuel mused. "I touch your land. What does that mean exactly?" Before Elena could answer, a commotion at the far end of the street caught their attention. A group of men on horseback was approaching ranch hands from the surrounding properties by the look of them. At their head rode Hayes Fletcher's foreman. "Trouble," Samuel murmured, his hand moving instinctively to his revolver. "Perhaps not," Elena replied, studying the riders' faces. They looked serious, but not hostile, determined rather than angry. The group reined in before the boarding house. Hayes dismounted and approached the porch, hat in hand. "Mrs. Ravenwing," he greeted her with unexpected courtesy. "Mr. Hawkins, we've come to talk." "About what?" Samuel asked cautiously. "About the Reed Ranch. Or I guess it's not really the Reed Ranch anymore, is it?" Hayes glanced back at the men behind him, who nodded encouragingly. "We've been talking the Hands and the other small ranchers. With Reed Reddick going to jail, what happens to the land?" Elena set down her coffee cup. "What do you think should happen to it?" Hayes shifted uncomfortably. "Well, ma'am, that's what we came to discuss. Reed's land includes water rights that most of us depend on. The northern grazing lands that feed half the cattle in the county. If the government seizes it all—" "You're worried about your livelihoods," Elena surmised. "Yes, ma'am, and not just ours. The whole town depends on that ranch one way or another." Elena studied the man's weathered face. Hayes had been Fletcher's right-hand man for years, carrying out his orders without question. But he had also been fair in his dealings with the other ranchers and was known to treat the Mexican and Indian workers with more respect than was common in the territory. "What do you propose?" she asked. Hayes straightened his shoulders. "A cooperative. The Hands would work the land together, sharing the profits. The water rights would be held in common, available to all the ranchers in the valley. No one man would own it all the way Reed did." Elena and Samuel exchanged surprised glances. It was a remarkably progressive idea for this time and place. "That would require legal arrangements," Samuel pointed out. "Contracts, a charter of some kind." "We know," Hayes agreed. "That's why we wanted to talk to you, Mr. Hawkins, with your government connections. And to you, Mrs. Ravenwing." He hesitated. "Seems to me that your husband was the first to recognize what Reed was doing wrong with the land. Maybe you'd have some ideas about how to do it right." Elena felt a strange emotion welling up inside her. something she hadn't experienced in a very long time. Hope. Not the grim determination that had sustained her through 5 years of planning her revenge, but genuine hope for a better future. "I would be honored to help," she said softly. "And Joseph would be pleased to see the land used for the benefit of all." Hayes nodded, relief evident in his face. "Thank you, ma'am. We'll need to move fast before the government officials arrive tomorrow." "Then we should begin now," Samuel said. "I believe Judge Patterson has a copy of the territorial land statutes in his office." As the men dispersed to gather the necessary resources, Elena remained on the porch, watching as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky. Day 5. I touch your land, not with destruction as she had once imagined, but with transformation. She reached for the counting cord at her waist and carefully untied the 5th knot, feeling the leather strand loosen in her fingers. 2 remained. Throughout the day, Elena moved between the judge's office, where Samuel and Hayes were drafting the legal documents for the cooperative, and the jail, where Thomas waited anxiously for news. With each hour that passed, the shape of the future became clearer, a future where no single man could control the resources that all depended upon where the land would be managed, according to both white man's law and the older traditions of stewardship that Elena's people had practiced for generations. By late afternoon, a crowd had gathered outside the jail, not in anger, but in celebration. The news of the cooperative had spread through town, bringing with it a sense of possibility that few had dared to imagine under Fletcher Reed's iron rule. Inside his cell, Reed, or Reddick, as everyone now called him, sat huddled in the corner, his once commanding presence diminished to a shadow. He had not spoken since their return from the canyon, refusing food and water, his eyes constantly darting to the empty corners of his cell as if expecting to see accusatory shapes forming there. "Is this what you wanted?" Sheriff Warren asked Elena as they stood watching the broken man through the bars. "To see him reduced to this?" Elena considered the question. In the darkest moments of her grief, when rage had threatened to consume her, perhaps she had wanted this to see Fletcher Reed destroyed, humiliated, terrified. But now, looking at the pathetic figure before her, she felt no satisfaction, only a weary sadness for all that his greed and cruelty had cost. "I wanted justice," she said finally. "For Joseph, for all those who suffered under his rule. What happens to him now is between him and his conscience." Warren nodded slowly. "Never much believed in your Apache spirits, Mrs. Ravenwing. Still don't, if I'm honest. But I've been a lawman long enough to know that guilt has a way of eating a man alive from the inside. Maybe that's spirit enough." As day 5 drew to a close, Elena returned to the boarding house to find Martha Reed waiting for her in the parlor. The bruise on her cheek had darkened, but her eyes were clear and resolute. "I'm leaving tomorrow," Martha said without preamble, "continuing on to Tucson once Caleb is well enough to travel." "You don't have to go," Elena said. "With Fletcher gone, you could stay. The house at the ranch—" Martha shook her head firmly. "I can't. Too many memories. Too much pain." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small object, which she pressed into Elena's hand. "I want you to have this." It was Joseph's pocket watch, the gold timepiece that Fletcher had taken from his body, the same watch that Thomas had been accused of stealing. The inscription inside the cover was just as Rose had described, "To Joseph Ravenwing for valor and loyalty from the men of Company B." "How did you get this?" Elena asked, her fingers tracing the familiar contours of the case. "Took it from Fletcher's dresser before I left," Martha admitted. "I knew it was Joseph's. Fletcher told me once when he was drunk, bragged about how he'd collected a souvenir from the meddling surveyor." Elena closed her hand around the watch, feeling its steady ticking against her palm like a heartbeat, like life continuing despite all efforts to stop it. "Thank you," she whispered. Martha touched her arm gently. "You asked me once years ago if I had seen anything unusual the night Joseph died. I lied to you then because I was afraid. I'm not afraid anymore." She took a deep breath. "Fletcher came home late that night with blood on his clothes. When I asked him about it, he said he'd had to deal with a problem at the north boundary. The next morning, when news came about Joseph's accident, I knew. I've carried that knowledge ever since." "Why tell me now?" Elena asked. "Because tomorrow the marshal comes and there will be a trial. They'll need a witness." Martha's face was set with determination. "I won't lie for him anymore. Not to save him from what he deserves." As Martha left to prepare for her journey, Elena held the watch to her ear, listening to its steady rhythm. Joseph's watch returning to her on the day she had touched Fletcher's land. The land that Joseph had died trying to protect. It seemed fitting somehow, as if the circle of justice were gradually closing. That night, Elena sat alone in her room at the boarding house. The counting cord before her on the small table, 5 knots now loosened, 2 remaining tight. Beside it lay Joseph's watch, its gold case gleaming in the lamplight. Day 5 had brought changes she could never have foreseen, not just the exposure of Fletcher's crimes or his capture, but the transformation of the land itself, from a source of division and conflict to a potential wellspring of cooperation and shared prosperity. Was this what Joseph would have wanted? She believed it was. He had always spoken of finding ways for their two peoples to live together in harmony with the land rather than fighting over it. The cooperative that Hayes had proposed came closer to that vision than anything Elena had seen since Joseph's death. She reached for the 6th knot on her counting cord, running her fingers over it, but not yet untying it. Tomorrow would be day 6. I touch your freedom. The marshal would arrive, Fletcher would be formally charged with Joseph's murder, and the legal process would begin. But as she sat in the quiet room listening to the ticking of Joseph's watch, Elena found herself wondering about the nature of freedom. Fletcher Reed would lose his freedom certainly either to the hangman's noose or to a prison cell for the remainder of his days. But what of her own freedom? For 5 years she had been bound by her grief, by her quest for vengeance, by the careful plans she had made for these 7 days. What would happen when the 7th day came? When the last knot was untied, the last step of her justice completed. What freedom might await her? Then Elena closed her eyes, picturing Thomas released from his cell, the two of them returning to their cabin, rebuilding the life that Fletcher Reed had shattered. She imagined her son growing to manhood, perhaps working on the cooperative ranch, perhaps finding another path entirely. And she saw herself no longer defined solely by her grief and her quest for justice, free to rediscover who she might be in a world where Fletcher Reed was nothing more than a fading memory. Day 6 approached. The hour of reckoning drew near, and beyond it, barely visible but growing clearer with each untied knot, the promise of a freedom Elena had almost forgotten was possible. The marshal arrived shortly before noon, accompanied by the territorial judge and 2 deputies. They rode in without fanfare, dusty from the trail, but moving with the purposeful efficiency of men accustomed to their duties. The judge, a stern-faced man named Holbrook, established a temporary court in the town hall, while the marshal, a veteran Indian fighter named Carson, went immediately to the jail to take charge of the prisoner. Elena watched from the steps of the boarding house as the legal machinery of the territory began to operate. Thomas had been released at dawn, the charges against him dismissed by Sheriff Warren himself. He stood beside her now, his hand in hers, watching the proceedings with solemn attention. "What happens now?" he asked. "Justice?" Elena replied. "White man's justice to follow our own." The trial, if it could be called that, was brief. With Martha Reed's testimony, the evidence Joseph had gathered, and Fletcher's own confession in the canyon, there was little room for doubt. Judge Holbrook, after hearing the arguments from both sides, pronounced his verdict with grim finality. "Frank Reddick, this court finds you guilty of the murder of Joseph Ravenwing fraud against the territorial government and multiple additional crimes, as enumerated by the prosecutor. You are hereby sentenced to hang by the neck until dead, said sentence to be carried out at dawn tomorrow." A murmur ran through the crowded town hall. "Dawn tomorrow, the seventh day. I touch your blood." As the marshal led Fletcher, now officially Frank Reddick, back to his cell, Elena felt a strange hollowness inside her. For 5 years, she had dreamed of this moment, had worked toward it with single-minded determination. Now that it had arrived, she found herself uncertain of what she felt. Samuel approached as the crowd began to disperse. "It's done," he said simply. "Justice has been served." "Has it?" Elena asked softly. "Is this truly justice, Samuel, or merely punishment?" He studied her face with concern, having second thoughts, not about his guilt, about whether his death will truly balance the scales. She looked toward the jailhouse, where Reddick would spend his final night on earth. Death comes to all men eventually, but understanding, remorse, those are rarer. "You think he's capable of those?" Samuel sounded skeptical. "I don't know, but I find myself wondering." As twilight gathered over Redemption Creek, Elena returned to her cabin for the first time since the trials had begun. The familiar surroundings welcomed her, the woven blankets, the herbs hanging from the rafters, the small altar where she had performed her rituals for these 7 days of justice. Thomas moved about the space, lighting lamps, rekindling the hearth fire that had gone cold in their absence. There was a new maturity in his movements, a gravity that hadn't been there before his time in the jail cell. "Will you go to see him?" Thomas asked suddenly. "Before tomorrow." Elena looked up, surprised by the question. "Reddick, why would I?" Thomas shrugged, poking at the fire. "To find out why. To hear him say it. I don't know, look him in the eye one last time." Elena considered her son's words. There was wisdom in them, a need for closure that she recognized in herself as well. For 5 years, Fletcher Reed had been the focus of her thoughts, the target of her planned revenge. Tomorrow he would be gone, and she would need to find a way to live beyond vengeance. "Perhaps I will," she said finally. "There are things I would ask him before the end." The jail was quiet when Elena arrived, the night deputy dozing at his desk. He startled awake at her entrance, then relaxed when he recognized her. "Mrs. Ravenwing, come to see the prisoner." Elena nodded. "If that's permitted?" Marshall said no visitors, but the deputy hesitated, then shrugged. "I reckon you've earned the right if anyone has. 5 minutes." Reddick was awake, sitting on the edge of his cot, staring at the floor. He looked up as Elena approached the bars, his face showing neither surprise nor fear. "Come to watch me suffer?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Get a head start on tomorrow's entertainment." "No," Elena said quietly. "I came to ask you why." "Why what?" "Why did I kill your husband?" Reddick gave a short, humorless laugh. "Because he was going to ruin everything. Expose my past. Take away everything I'd built." "Was it worth it? All the death, all the lies, all the years of living in fear that your past would find you?" Reddick was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant as if looking back over the winding path that had led him to this cell. I thought it was, he said finally, when I first came here after deserting after Missouri. I thought I could start over, become someone else, build something that would last. He looked up at her, his expression suddenly vulnerable. Do you know what it's like to hate yourself so much that you have to become someone else entirely? I know what it's like to lose everything you love, Elena replied. To have to rebuild a life from ashes. Reddick nodded slowly. I didn't plan to kill him, you know. Your husband. I just wanted to frighten him, make him give up his investigation. But then he looked at me with those knowing eyes, and I couldn't bear to be seen like that. To be known. And now, everyone knows, Elena said. Your name, your crimes, everything you tried to hide. Yes. Reddick's voice was barely audible. Everything. Elena studied the broken man before her. The proud, powerful rancher was gone, leaving only this hollow shell behind. She had expected to feel triumph in this moment, or at least satisfaction. Instead, she felt only a profound sadness for all that had been lost. Joseph's life, Thomas's childhood, even the potential for good that Fletcher Reed might have achieved had he chosen a different path. I untie the sixth knot, she said softly. I touch your freedom, Frank Reddick. Tomorrow at dawn, your journey in this world ends. And your revenge will be complete, he said bitterly. Not revenge, Elena corrected him. Justice, for Joseph, for all those you harmed. As she turned to leave, Reddick called after her. The visions in the canyon. Was that really? Elena paused, but did not turn back. The earth remembers Frank Reddick. The spirits witness. Nothing is ever truly forgotten. She left him with those words, returning to the night air, to the stars overhead, to the future that awaited beyond the seventh day. Dawn broke over Redemption Creek with a crimson light that stained the clouds and mountain peaks like blood. The town was eerily quiet, with most of its citizens gathered in the central square where the gallows had been hastily reconstructed. The previous structure where Thomas had so nearly met his fate had been damaged during the wild horse incident on day one. This new scaffold stood stark against the morning sky, a bare wooden frame with a single rope dangling from its crossbeam. Elena and Thomas stood apart from the crowd, watching as Marshal Carson and his deputies led Frank Reddick from the jail. The condemned man walked with his head bowed, showing none of the arrogance that had once been Fletcher Reed's trademark. As he mounted the steps to the gallows, Reddick suddenly looked up, his gaze finding Elena in the crowd. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Elena felt a strange connection between them, not forgiveness, certainly, but perhaps a kind of recognition. They had been bound together by fate and choice, by death and vengeance, by justice, both human and divine. The marshal read the formal sentence, his voice carrying across the hushed square. A priest stepped forward to offer last rites, which Reddick accepted with a bowed head. Then the noose was placed around his neck. The hood offered, but refused. "Any last words?" the marshal asked, following protocol. Reddick straightened his shoulders, looking out over the gathered townspeople who had once feared and respected him as Fletcher Reed. "I killed Joseph Ravenwing," he said, his voice clear in the morning stillness. "I killed others before him. I lied, I stole, I built my life on deception." He paused, swallowing hard. "And I am sorry, not just for being caught, for the lives I took, the pain I caused." His eyes found Elena again. "Mrs. Ravenwing, I can't bring your husband back, but I die knowing that you were stronger than I ever was. You stayed true to yourself while I became a lie." The marshal nodded to his deputy, who moved to the lever. There was a brief moment of absolute stillness, as if the entire world held its breath. Then The trap door opened, the rope pulled taut, and Frank Reddick's mortal journey ended. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the seventh and final knot on her counting cord loosen and fall away as if untied by invisible hands. It was done. 7 days, 7 knots, 7 steps of justice. Joseph's murderer had been exposed, judged, and executed. The land had been transformed. The truth had prevailed. And yet, as the crowd began to disperse, Elena felt no surge of triumph, no satisfaction in watching her enemy die. Instead, she felt a vast empty space opening inside her, the void left behind. When vengeance is finally achieved, when the driving force that has sustained you for years suddenly vanishes. Thomas seemed to sense her thoughts. "What do we do now?" he asked quietly as they walked away from the square. Elena looked at her son, no longer a child, not yet fully a man, but forever changed by the events of these 7 days. "We live," she said simply. "We honor your father's memory not through more death, but through life. Through building rather than destroying." They returned to their cabin on the outskirts of town, where Elena went immediately to her altar. The counting cord lay there, all 7 knots, now untied, the leather strands hanging loose and free. Beside it, Joseph's gold watch ticked steadily, marking the passage of time, the continuity of life beyond death. Elena picked up the counting cord, running it through her fingers one last time. Then, with deliberate movements, she carried it outside to where the morning sun bathed the earth in golden light. From her pocket, she took a small bundle of sage and cedar, which she placed beneath the cedar tree that Joseph had planted when Thomas was born. "It is finished, beloved," she whispered, placing the counting cord atop the herbs. "Justice has come as I promised. May your spirit find peace." She struck a match, touching it to the herbs and cord. The sage and cedar caught quickly, the fragrant smoke rising toward the sky, carrying with it the physical embodiment of her 5-year quest. The leather cord blackened and curled, then crumbled to ash. As Elena watched the smoke dissipate in the morning air, she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders, not suddenly, but gradually, like the slow release of a breath long held. The rage that had sustained her, the cold determination that had driven her forward, began to give way to something else: possibility. The possibility of joy returning, of peace taking root, of a future not defined solely by the past. Thomas joined her beneath the cedar tree, his hand finding hers. Together, they watched the last wisps of smoke vanish into the clear blue sky. 7 days had passed. Justice had been served, and now at last healing could begin.